With China and the EU trying to strengthen their ties, while at the same time relations between China and the US facing challenges, what can we make of the timing of US Vice President Mike Pence's speech at the Hudson Institute, at which he strongly condemned China? And how can the rest of the world promote multilateralism in the face of rising unilateralism? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. An Asia-Europe summit of more than 50 countries opened on Thursday in Brussels in the bid to boost cooperation and regional connectivity. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang joined other Asian and European leaders at the meeting. The biannual summit, representing over half of the world's population and GDP, has taken on added significance since the US launched trade tariffs against China and pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement and the Iran nuclear deal. All of this is happening against the backdrop of US Vice President Mike Pence giving a speech 2 weeks ago to the Hudson Institute in which he castigated China on many fronts, triggering a predictable Chinese reaction. How can we make sense of the significance of the Asia-Europe relationship against the backdrop of tensions between China and the US? Joining me from New York is Reifowitz, Professor of Historical Studies at S.U.N.Y Empire State College. Also from New York, Teng, President of the America-China Public Affairs Institute, and from Brussels, Daniel Gros, Director of the Center for European Policy Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Gros, let me go to you first. EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini insisted that they didn't organize the meeting against anybody. She said, we have our agenda and it's very clear that it's an agenda that clearly supports multilateralism, starting from the UN system, climate change action and trade. But she also said that this meeting was not any Trump meeting. Do these two things stand next to each other, Mr. Gros?
Unfortunately, they have to stand next to each other. Europe still relies on the US for its security, and Europe and America remain allies. But between allies, you can also have disagreements, sometimes very strong disagreements. And where certainly Europe disagrees with the US is on trade and on its stance towards China. And that's, I think, why this summit was a very useful occasion for Europe to say, we are different, we are not like the Americans, we like to keep very intensive relationships with all of Asia, including China, and we are open for business.
Well, at this moment, we have seen, of course, President Trump pulling out of some UN organizations, pulling out of some multilateral agreements, such as the Paris Climate Agreement or the Iran nuclear deal. But Professor Reifowitz, has President Trump or any of his senior cabinet members explicitly said they are against multilateralism? Do they have a clear standing on this issue? Do we know it?
Well, they don't necessarily use the words, we are against multilateralism. I mean, if you think about multilateralism simply meaning working in concert with other like-minded countries, who could really be against that? But having said that, if you look at their policies, you can see certainly on trade where they have very clearly said that they prefer bilateral trade agreements to multilateral trade agreements. Trump has said that, I prefer negotiating one-on-one with countries. So right there, that's as specific a rejection of multilateralism as you're going to get. Certainly the Paris Climate Accord is multilateralism, and he's pulled out of that. The Iran deal really was a multilateral approach, and he seems to believe that he can get Iran to bend to his will if he goes into some sort of direct sanctions against them. So in theory, he's not against multilateralism, but in practice, he certainly appears to be.
Professor, Mr. Teng, let me go to you about China's message to this Asia-Europe meeting. Premier Li Keqiang going there on his 9-day Eurasia trip, and China at a very delicate period of time where China needs partners who have the same position in terms of safeguarding trade multilateralism. So what kind of message do you think Premier Li Keqiang wants to bring to that meeting and wants to hear from his Asian and European partners, and whether he could hear some of it, at least.
Well, certainly China is the largest economy in Asia, and this is an Asia-Europe meeting, so certainly China plays a very important part of that. I think that, you know, just by being there and meeting with the leaders of all of the countries to show that China is really serious for a global partnership and to face the global challenges.
Well, it's a very broad statement, big ambitions, I guess you wanted to say there. But at this moment, I guess European countries also have their calculations, have their troubled stances. Let's say on the one hand, they need China's partnership, they need Chinese market. On the other hand, they don't want to offend their American partners. And on that front, they're not given an easy time by their U.S. partners. The latest news coming out of the United States is U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross criticizing his EU counterpart, saying President Trump's patience is not unlimited and the Europeans need to speed up and get to near-term deliverables in terms of trade negotiations between the EU and the US. He said this hours after the EU's trade commissioner blamed Washington for not having engaged the EU to establish a framework of a future trade pact. So, Mr. Gros, how big is the difference between the EU and the US on this issue?
Oh, there's really a gulf between the two, an Atlantic, if you want, an entire ocean, because the EU is used to working on long-term policies with a very careful, prepared agenda, with lots of bureaucratic detail in there. And it has never done a trade agreement in 3 months. And the US, however, which usually follows the same approach, now has a president who wants to have results yesterday, even if they're very superficial and don't mean a lot on the ground. And I think we see this clash of civilizations, if you want, between the two. And therefore, I predict that we might have some sort of superficial agreement towards the end of the year, but there's not enough time to do anything more careful.
The theme of this year's meeting between Asian and European leaders is global partners for global challenges. So with the US touting America first, Professor Reifowitz, what kind of alliance, what kind of global partnership do you think can be formed between the US and the EU at least?
Well, listen, there are U.S. long-term interests, and then there are the specific interests of this administration and this president. And I think Mr. Gros made a good point about looking at short-term, perhaps surface-level victories being really what the Trump presidency is looking for. Europe and the United States have a common political system. They have common political values. Their alliance goes back 75 years. I don't believe that this one president will be able to destroy it completely. Could he damage it? Absolutely. But I think trade is one issue where there are some differences, and the environment is another. But in the long run, the United States and Europe need to work together around the globe to promote democracy, to promote the freedoms that both countries, both parts of the world are really rely on in terms of their political systems. I think it's perhaps for the Europeans it's a matter of just sort of getting through this administration, waiting it out, and hoping that things get better with the next one.
Well, what about the possibility between China and the United States forming some kind of a partnership in addressing these global issues? Mr. Teng, we all know that Vice President Pence made this very high-profile speech to the Hudson Institute where he blasted China for its aggressive policies. And this was seen as the first time that a U.S. Senior official has strung together kind of a narrative of Chinese aggression and delivered them so publicly. What do you think of the possibility of the U.S. and China working together anytime soon?
Well, I think that with the current administration, like Wilbur Ross said, the trade talk will be on a hiatus. However, in the United States, I would say that most of the people does not agree with the President Trump's policy. However, his team is in charge, and President Trump has the executive power to exercise some of this withdrawal. You know, they also withdraw from the TPP. They just withdraw from the postal system. They're withdrawing from even the Geneva Protocol of diplomatic exchange. There are many of the things United States is withdrawing, and this is going to be certainly going to be a challenge for United States with other countries. However, in terms of China, you know, Europe actually export more to Asia than to the United States, and Asia export more to Europe than to the United States. So the Europe and Asia are actually greater trading partners than with the United States. China is feeling in terms of the challenge of the tariff, but they're looking for new partners, especially in Europe, to overcome some of their difficulties.
Mr. Gros, what is your comment to what Fred just said there? Specifically, what can Europe and China do to forge a stronger global partnership, a stronger partnership for global good? And what are the challenges facing these two sides at this moment?
Of course, when we're talking about global challenges, let's think about the environment. There, of course, more cooperation is possible, and just upholding the Paris Agreement would already be an important step. In the WTO, we know that the Americans are basically sabotaging it. Can we do something? Maybe just between Europe and China we could think about how we could salvage the WTO, making it a WTO without the US. This kind of thinking might be possible. And finally, there's a question of what do we do in bilateral relationships between the EU and China. There's an endless negotiation going on a bilateral investment treaty that could be accelerated. And some time ago there was even talk about a free trade agreement between the EU and China. All this remains on the table, and if the leaders want to take the political initiative, these are concrete things Europe and China could do together.
At this moment, having heard from Vice President Pence about his speech, what he said about China, Mr. Gros, what is the reaction in Europe? How do European analysts look at this speech? Do they see it as some kind of rational expose of the U.S.'s new strategy toward China, or rather an emotional piece used to rally political votes?
They understand the reasons. They understand the U.S. frustration. And from history, we know in Europe it's very unsettling always if there's a new power coming up which threatens the hegemony of the incumbent. But of course, we in Europe, we are far. We can say, sorry, U.S., life is tough. You are not always the only number one. There's a number two coming up on the fast lane, and maybe it will overtake you. It is better not to pick a fight with number two, but just to come to a living agreement so that all of us can live in a more secure world. The way the U.S. is reacting, it seems to us, at least in Europe, is that it is not even in the U.S. interest. It makes the entire world less safe, less sound, and damages the economy of everybody. Therefore, we Europeans, of course, would tend to tell the Americans that they should take a different approach.
Professor Reifowitz, how do you look at the significance of, or the lack of significance of that speech there of Vice President Pence? Is this taken seriously within the academic circle, at least?
Well, I don't think it represents any kind of change for U.S. policy. It is for domestic consumption. You have to realize it was delivered to a conservative audience at the Hudson Institute. It was delivered to some degree, at least, to motivate base voters. We have President Trump's conservative base, very strong, economic nationalists, as Steve Bannon, Trump's former advisor and sometime guru, put it. And Mike Pence's speech was an economic nationalist speech, but it was also a challenge to China's China's rise across the world. I think we have an election next month, and it's about getting those voters.
Yeah, but the speech was heard everywhere, in China, in Europe as well, and a lot of discussion from the Chinese, very strong reaction. So, Professor Reifowitz, what kind of impact do you think such a speech is going to have on relations between China and the United States, which are already at a low point? Very briefly, please.
Right. One thing is, I don't think this White House really cares what the reaction is around the world. It speaks, it really prizes its own political position above anything else. I don't know that it's going to change the reaction around the world. I think actions speak louder than words, and this administration has been quite unilateral all along.
Okay. Well, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to Ian Reifowitz, Professor of Historical Studies at S.U.N.Y Empire State College, Fred Teng, President of the America-China Public Affairs Institute, and Daniel Gros, Director of the Center for European Policy Studies. We'll take a short break. You have been watching The Point with me, Li Keqiang. When I come back, we'll be looking into how to promote multilateralism in the era with uncertainties. Stay with me. For nearly a century, the U.S. has promoted its view of the world as an ideal that other countries should aspire to. Since President Trump came to power, however, that very concept of multilateralism has been put into question as President Trump pursues his America First agenda while crediting his protectionist trade policies for bringing about deals with other countries and economies. But as the rest of the world remains strong advocates of multilateralism, is President Trump really trying to undermine their united efforts to protect diversity and collaboration, or is it more a question of style over substance? At the same time, what is China doing to safeguard multilateralism? I sat down with Dr. Vladimir Yakunin, Chairman of the Supervisory Board of the Dialogue of Civilizations Research Institute on the Greek island of Rhodes. And I began by asking him whether multilateralism still has a place in today's world or is being threatened.
Listen, both, I suppose. Though, you know, everyone is ready to say, democratically wise, you know, every country has its own right to say something or to do what they consider to be right. In reality, it looks differently. So, to our opinion, it is essential to stay for the possibility of the interaction and collaboration of different cultures, different views, even if it is not coincide completely, because, you know, the globe is a very tiny house for all the civilizations today.
At this moment, are we seeing, I think it is no secret that, for instance, the United States is very much against this idea of multilateralism. Basically, they were the one who founded this idea, or who founded the position, the base of this idea at the end of the Second World War. And President Trump is saying, we don't want to be part of this multilateralism. What are you saying to that?
Listen, I never heard that Mr. Trump said we don't want to be part of multilateralism.
Well, what I meant was that he was withdrawing from multilateral agreements or multilateral institutions, and he was talking about preferring patriotism instead of globalism. So what are your comments?
Yes, correct. Here I agree with you. But, you know, it doesn't reject, you know, does not necessarily reject the acceptance of the diversity of the world, because world is diverse. You know, whether, you know, one president likes it or not, whether one country likes it or not, or another, but, you know, we inhabit the same house. This is the house of Earth. And because of that, we need to be very particular about the others, not to consider the other to be immediately the enemy. The other, this is just an invitation for discussion and collaboration.
Yeah. What evidence, what signs give you the confidence or the possibility that President Trump and his administration might not be necessarily against multilateralism? Do you think that he's still a believer of multilateralism? It is possible that the system might still work.
Recently, it was announced that still Canada, Mexico, and the United States of America, they are signing new agreement on the free trade on the continent. So this is multilateralism.
Well, he actually went with these countries respectively. He first went and negotiated with with Mexico, and then he negotiated with Canada. Of course, he's bundling them together. Do you see that as multilateralism, or do you see that as the U.S. putting itself first and unilaterally coming?
Listen, I suppose maybe you're right. From the point of view of technique, you know, united the best and the most important. And I am standing on this position. That is the position of Mr. Trump. But inevitably, whether it is the position or not, if the others are not in agreement, it is not possible to have this kind of agreement signed. This is at least my opinion. But of course, this predominance of the interest of the United States of America, we clearly see in every attempt of the recent administration of the United States to change already signed and sealed agreement. And from the point of view of international law, of course, this is not a good sign.
Yeah, does that undermine the spirit of dialogue, the spirit of negotiations over the use of dominance, of military power, of hard power to achieve your goal?
Listen, if you are talking about dialogue of civilization, it is not undermining, but it is enforcing our mandate and our wish to introduce dialogue as the only instrument to settle all the disputes and all the conflicts. But from the point of view of the general consideration, of course, this way undermining the basis for that kind of balanced and, may I say, united efforts of the world to, protect peace, diversity, and collaboration.
At this moment, do you see the United States interested in having a dialogue with other countries on the level of civilization, of making multilateralism work?
You know, to my mind, United States today are in the very deep crisis in terms of, situation in the society. This is not my opinion. I'm just repeating some considerations of my partners from the United States of America and experts who are considering the situation inside American society. And I suppose this is just the reflection of the general situation in the world. You know, already some very reputable experts, they proclaimed the necessity to change the existing model. They were mainly talking about economic model. But it is not possible to divide economy and politics. So we are talking about crisis like a system crisis or systematic crisis. From this point of view, I think that the United States and this administration, they also are aware of these problems, the way how to find the settlement, what will be the model. That is the essential issues for think tanks and platforms like Dialogue of Civilization.
To find solutions, you have to know the causes and you have to know the symptoms, first of all. What kind of symptoms? What is wrong with this current system? Would you elaborate, first of all?
The entire system in the development after the World War II was designed and somehow structured for bilateral world, two-polar world, you remember. On one side, Soviet Union, on the other side, United States of America with alliance. When the Soviet Union ceased to exist, the entire system crippled, the balance was missed, disappeared. And then the appetite, to introduce only one point of view to be the right point of view, predominated, if you know what I mean. That was wrong. That was wrong because even, the small country, not very strong economically, not very strong from the point of view of political system. Even this small country has the right for self-development. And that should be taken as the basis for new international platform to create new world.
Where is China's position in this process of finding a new balance there? China is not one of the smaller countries which couldn't really speak out. His presence is very strong, but it was not the former Soviet Union. It is, in your words, where does China find itself?
Listen, China is playing a very important and growing role in the world international relations. It is due to Mr. Xi Jinping's declaration of the promotion of globalization worldwide during the recent session in Davos, for example. That was proclaimed during the Party Congress in China, and we are following everything like that, not only about China. It is impossible that, say, you know, China and the United States of America, suddenly, you know, they are not having any kind of trade relations. Impossible, because, you know, that is already global economy. This is first. And second, which is more important, China presents for the rest of the world, not G8 world, but for the rest of the world, that, you know, hard labor, proper politics, and instruments, market instruments, but with the knowledge of existing setbacks of the model, can provide the country with the ability to rise that high. And China is leading in this developing world nowadays, though it is already developed. But we know that China has still a lot of, you know, problems to be settled. But nevertheless, it is leading economic power, and the political influence of China is getting more and more high.
You think it is possible at this particular moment? The signs that we are seeing is confrontation, the possibility of confrontation is actually going up.
It is must. It is not possible or not possible. It is must. Because if not, that's what the mankind is facing. Global clash, I suppose nobody will vote for that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yakunin. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Li Keqiang. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.